Chapter 10, George Washington. George Washington was born in the Virginia colony. On February 22nd, 1732, George's parents owned a large house with a lot of farmland. George was a quiet, shy boy. His father died when George was 11 years old. George then helped his mother manage the family farm. He learned how to be a good farmer. George was a soldier in Virginia. He was tall and strong. In 1754, Great Britain and France began fighting in the French and Indian War. George became a leader of the Virginian army. He was 22 years old. George and the Americans helped the British win the war. It's a nice summary, but as we know, George Washington actually helped start the French and Indian War by his decisions and attacking the French and Indian diplomats. In 1759, George married a wealthy woman named Martha. George and Martha Washington lived in a large, beautiful house in Virginia. They called their home Mount Vernon. There were large farms at Mount Vernon. George loved to manage his farms. Let's also please call this out. These are plantations with plenty of slaves. These large farms were plantations. In 1775, the American Revolution began. George wanted the American colonies to become independent. He became the commander-in-chief of the American army. This means that he was the leader of all the American soldiers. The soldiers called him General Washington. George lost a battle in New York City, New York, but he did not give up. He took his army south to Pennsylvania. On Christmas 1776, George took his army to Trenton, New Jersey. We've find Trenton on the map. We've studied this battle. So on page 60. Just want to look quick. Okay, so it's right near New York City, relatively. It's pretty close to Philadelphia, too. George knew that the British Army there would be having Christmas parties. They would not be ready to fight. George's army surprised the British Army. The British Army surrendered. General Washington won the Battle of Trenton, but the war was not over. So just to be more exact, if we remember, we studied this, and it was really Hessian army under Colonel Rawl. No, not really a British. It was under the British jurisdiction, of course, but they were German Hessian soldiers. The British and the Americans continued to fight. The American army did not have enough food, clothes, or guns. Many soldiers became sick during the cold winters. Most soldiers liked George Washington. They stayed with him and helped him fight for American freedom. Martha Washington helped the American army during the war. Martha stayed with George during the 6 cold winters of the American Revolution. She sewed clothes for the soldiers. She fixed their torn shirts and pants. Martha took care of soldiers who became sick or hurt. In 1781, the Americans won an important battle at Yorktown, Virginia. There, the British Army surrendered to George Washington. The American Revolution was over. In 1783, Great Britain and the colonies signed a peace treaty. Then General Washington said goodbye to the army. He was ready to go home to Mount Vernon. Soon the American people needed George Washington again. They wanted him to help write the Constitution in 1787. American leaders met in Philadelphia to write new laws for the United States. These meetings were called the Constitutional Convention. George became president of the Constitutional Convention. He helped the leaders work together to write laws. After that, he wanted to return to Mount Vernon. But America voted for George to be the new country's first president. And I already talked about in the intro how just amazing and important it was that Washington kept wanting to go home. He didn't need to be king. He didn't need to rule the country. He did rule the country for a time and then left and gave command to someone else. And that's very important. That's what we do every 4 to 8 years when we elect new presidents. George Washington became our president in 1789. Martha Washington became the First Lady. The government of the United States was in New York City. So George and Martha left Mount Vernon. They traveled to New York City. George was America's hero. As he traveled, crowds everywhere cheered for him. George wanted the United States to have a new capital city. George found a beautiful place for the capital between Maryland and Virginia. George asked a Frenchman named Pierre Lafont to plan the new city. Benjamin Banneker, a free African-American, helped Lafont plan the new city. Banneker knew a lot about math and science. He used math and science to help plan the boundaries of the new capital. Banneker also wrote to American leaders about ending slavery in the new country. In 1800, the government moved to the new capital. The capital is now called Washington, D.C. George Washington was president for 8 years. As president, George helped the United States become a stronger nation. In 1797, George returned to Mount Vernon. He died at his home in 1799. George Washington was one of our greatest American leaders. He led our country in war and in peace. Many people call him the father of our country. It says many people call him the father of our country. He's the father of our country. I mean, I don't know how that's even debated. You know, and he was a great man, a hero of mine. But we also got to say what he did wrong. I mean, he owned slaves. I believe he freed all his personal slaves that he owned at the end of his life. He didn't free all of the slaves on his plantations because most of them were owned by Martha. I believe that's what happened. All right, you know, a man of his era. He did want to end slavery, but just like we've talked about Thomas Jefferson and Washington, they would end slavery if everyone else did. They voted to end slavery, but they couldn't man up and become poor. They wouldn't do that. So, you know, that might be a weakness, right? Maybe you should have. But great man nonetheless. And thank you for listening, and hope you learn about George Washington this week. Bye.